Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to American Enterprise Institute headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome online viewers as well. It is a beautiful spring morning here in Washington. And so, of course, this means it's time to discuss the North Korean nuclear threat. The North Korean nuclear menace has been the occasion of glaring, I think, unmistakable and persisting failure for Washington policymakers for what's now a 30-year spate. Under 5 administrations, both blue and red, we've seen the North Korean nuclear menace only grow through different ostensible approaches to policies, different policy names. The North Korean nuclear arsenal has only increased. 30 years ago, North Korea was an isolated, remote, impoverished dictatorship without nuclear weapons. Today, it is an isolated, remote, impoverished dictatorship with nuclear weapons. And this continuing failure is an unsustainable path, I think, for us all to be on. A team from the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK, and from the National Institute for Public Policy decided to do a diagnostic of what had gone wrong and came up with some suggestions for how we might be able to make things go right in the future. We have 3 of the members of this team here. Before introducing them, I should also mention other members of our dream team. The great Robert M. Collins, long of USFK, Olivia Enos, a human rights advocate, and Colonel David Maxwell of FDD and Global Peace Initiative. This morning, we'll have a discussion of this report, the problem that needs to be addressed, and the prospects for addressing it, with 3 of the authors of this report, Ambassador Robert Joseph, an Undersecretary of State, U.S. government, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, long of the U.S. intelligence community, and Mr. Greg Scarlatoiu, the executive director of HRNK. You can read more about them in the online information about our event. But I think that to begin our discussion, I'd like to throw it to Bob Joseph to tell a little bit about the thinking that went into this report and the suggestions that are going to come out of it.
Terrific. Well, good morning. Nick, thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank also your colleagues here at AEI for their efforts in producing this. As Nick said, this was a very collaborative effort on the part of, in my view, truly experienced and deeply committed experts in 2 different areas. One is the national security area. And Joe and myself, Dave, I mean, that's our community. The other community is the human rights community. And Olivia, Greg, Nick, represented that community very well. Normally, these two communities are separate, almost like they're in silos. We brought the two communities together, and based on sort of the deep experiences, we had a wide variety of views expressed, a wide variety of perceptions that came into sort of our discussions and deliberations. We all agreed that we needed to have a new comprehensive approach for dealing with North Korea. As Nick said, there's been a remarkable consistency in US policy for 3 decades across Republican and Democratic administrations alike. Each one has placed denuclearization through negotiations at the center of US policy. And there's been a remarkable consistency in the failure of that policy. Exhibit A, of course, is the North Korean nuclear arsenal. Not too long ago, North Korea was engaging in relatively small-scale plutonium reprocessing for 1 or 2 weapons. Then they moved, in addition to plutonium reprocessing, they moved to uranium enrichment. Today, it's 40 to 60 weapons. As we cite in the report, there's a RAND study that says it's possible that by 2027, 4 years from now, that's not very long, 4 years from now, North Korea could have over 200 weapons. Just think about that. More than the UK, more than France. It is a future that I think would be even much greater than the challenges that we face today, particularly when you think about North Korea's propensity for selling whatever it has to the highest bidder. You know, you've got to think about selling to rogue states and even selling to terrorist entities. So this drove us to the position that what we needed was a paradigm shift. We needed to think differently about the North Korean threat and about how to handle that threat. And again, we wove together sort of national security and human rights approaches. And we came up with a strategy based on 6 strategic propositions that are outlined in the report. Let me just touch on some of those. The first one was, as long as the Kim regime exists, as long as the dynasty exists, we will be confronted with a greater and greater nuclear problem. And of course, the missile program is, you know, moves in coordination with the growth in the nuclear arsenal. The second strategic proposition is that perhaps, let me strike that, the greatest vulnerability of the regime comes from within, comes from with its own people, the alienation of its own people, the brutality over 70 years of the Kim regime. It is the last of the totalitarian countries. It is the most brutal regime, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the repression of the North Korean people. And that really took us to emphasizing in our strategy human rights up front. The need to work to inform and influence the North Korean people so that they will become key to the replacement of the regime. That said, this is not a strategy that's about human rights for the sake of human rights only, even though that is the morally important thing to do, the moral imperative, I would argue. But this is also the path to dealing with the challenges, the national security challenges, including the nuclear threat that we face. The third strategic proposition deals with the need for a comprehensive strategy, a containment strategy, because this isn't a silver bullet that's going to result in quick change. We've got to contain the problem. We've got to contain it through classical means, through a strong defense, through a strong deterrent, including our nuclear offensive capability and missile defenses to provide for not only deterring North Korea against direct threats to the United States and our forces, but also to our allies, South Korea and Japan in particular. We also need to combine sort of this effort with the other tools of statecraft. Diplomacy is very important. Economic sanctions are very important. Intelligence is very important. All of the tools we need to integrate into this comprehensive strategy. We say very clearly as another of our strategic propositions that we do not believe that the preemptive use of force on our part is appropriate for regime change. We need to be very upfront about that. Unless, of course, there is high confidence that the North Koreans are about to attack, particularly if they're about to attack with weapons of mass destruction. And finally, in terms of the strategic propositions, we understand that there's going to be a great deal of resistance to this new approach. There's going to be resistance, of course, from North Korea. There's going to be resistance from Russia and China, both in terms of their own sensitivity to human rights violations on the part of their governments. And there's going to be resistance within the US institutions, the bureaucracies. It's never easy for bureaucracies to change the way they've been thinking, and they've been thinking about this for 30 years in the same fashion. I mean, it truly does approach sort of the Einstein definition of insanity. You continue to do the same thing over and over for 3 decades, expecting a different result. We need to shift fundamentally. We are not proposing the end of diplomacy, which is how some have greeted our effort. Well, this will end diplomacy. Well, not at all. I mean, diplomacy remains a very important tool, just like it did in the Cold War when we were deterring and containing the Soviet Union. Diplomacy is an essential instrument. And as I said, we're not proposing the use of military force to achieve regime change. This is regime change from within. And it's regime change from within by the North Korean people through the type of efforts that we recommend, and I know that Greg will elaborate on. And finally, our report deals with a number of the myths. And myths are very powerful in the national security area. And I can give you many different examples. But one of the myths, and I think Joe will talk about this, is that if you promote human rights, if you insist on human rights as part of your platform or part of your approach, then the other side, in this case North Korea, won't deal with you. It was the same thing that was said about President Reagan's promotion of human rights in the context of his agenda with the Soviet Union. And he insisted on that over the objections of the bureaucracies, of the US bureaucracies, particularly the State Department, because it would interfere with negotiations on arms control, or it would interfere with negotiations on regional issues. Well, in fact, it did not, and we did achieve arms control agreements. What it did is send a very powerful signal to Soviet leaders, and it's fascinating, I think, to go through the memoirs of Soviet leaders, and just, you can feel the concern, you can feel the fear that they felt about the US pushing the human rights agenda. But it didn't lead to what the so-called experts predicted. In fact, quite the contrary. Let me stop there and turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. I should mention that the study, the report, is called National Strategy for Countering North Korea. It came out earlier this year. There will be copies available outside. You can also link to it online through the event page for our event today. Greg?
Nick, thank you very much, and let me begin by thanking you for hosting this event. It has been a tremendous honor and a privilege to be part of this study group and to co-author together with you, Nick, Bob, Joe, our board member, David Maxwell, Dr. Nolan. We're very happy that you're able to join us today. You're also a board member of the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. So as Ambassador Joseph mentioned, for over 30 years, human rights has been sacrificed for the sake of addressing very important issues. Nukes and missiles, after all, millions of lives are at stake. Those are also very important issues. Those of us who are IR majors early on take their 101 in conflict resolution, and we learn about the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement, and the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated deal, and how to get to yes. The North Koreans do not go to the school of the ZOPA or the BATNA. They go to the school of the zero-sum game. My gain is your loss is my gain. By abandoning human rights, we do not create a ZOPA or expand a ZOPA because there is no ZOPA. What we want, as in we, the UN, the responsible international community, what we want is CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. What the North Koreans want is to hang on to their nuclear weapons and gain recognition as a nuclear weapons state. Abandoning human rights does not resolve anything. Rather, it's a sign of weakness, abandonment. It's quite frankly unconditional surrender. On a front that's very important. Why does the Kim regime act the way it does? Precisely because it's an egregious human rights violator. We're not going through the list of human rights violations today, but the Kim regime is committing crimes against humanity. So this group decided that it was time to come up with a new strategy, try something new, as Ambassador Joseph said. So this concept of human rights upfront approach was first developed within the UN system. It was a concept very dear to the previous UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. What this means within the UN context is to bring together the human rights, the humanitarian, and the political arm of the UN in order to factor in human rights into any initiative or intervention. To put it very simply, if you're planning on having a humanitarian intervention in North Korea, you should raise issues such as transparency, access, and yes, you should be aware of the human rights situation inside the country, of the UN Commission of Inquiry report. We had an episode in 2016 after Typhoon Lion Rock with Joe Bermudez, our senior satellite imagery analyst. We looked at the cloud cover. We could see Camp 12, Chonggori, where women forcibly repatriated from China are held. 800 out of 1,000 women were forcibly repatriated. We communicated with the UN, and then the Deputy Secretary General, Ina Lasson, responded within minutes. They were conducting a fact-finding mission in the area, just 3 clicks down the road, pretty much. The response was swift, but there was no action on the ground, in particular because there is this tension between the humanitarian arm, the human rights arm, the political arm, and except for the human rights arm, the other arms of the UN, yes, also regard human rights perhaps as an obstacle to executing their mission. Ambassador Joseph mentioned that this is an approach somehow echoing the approach to the Soviet Union during the Reagan administration. We do not advocate in favor of violent change. We do not advocate in favor of regime change. We advocate in favor of gradual change in North Korea. As Ambassador Joseph said, the dime is very important. The application of the 4 elements of national power, diplomatic, information, military, economic. We in the human rights world are more focused on the I, in the dime. So basically, this is based on the idea that change can only come from the people of North Korea, and what the outside world can do to help the people of North Korea is to empower them through information. Now, of course, it's important to remember what we coined as the 3 stories. There are 3 basic stories that the people of North Korea need to understand. The story of the corruption of their own leadership. North Korea is a bizarre hybrid, combining private entrepreneurship, totalitarian regime control, and a very high degree of corruption, resulting in particular from that predicament. So it's important that the people of North Korea understand the corruption of their leadership, in particular the corruption of the inner core of the Kim family regime. It's also important that the people of North Korea understand the story of their own human rights. North Korea has adhered to international human rights instruments as a UN member state since 1991, to the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Women's Convention, the Children's Convention, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. North Korea has a constitution, and yet during those weekly, at least weekly, ideological indoctrination and self-criticism sessions, they're not taught about their own constitution or their own legislation or international obligations the DPRK has assumed, as Bob Collins, whose name has been mentioned, he's one of the co-authors of this report. As Bob Collins would tell you, all they know is the TPMI, the 10 Principles of Monolithic Ideology, the 10 Fundamental Tenets, the 10 Commandments of the Kim family regime, all aiming for one purpose: to maintain the Kim regime in power. It will be very important to remember that there are multiple North Koreas. The North Korean regime continues to discriminate against its own people based on a perceived loyalty-based system called Songbun. There are 3 social categories: the core class, the wavering class, and the hostile class, more than 50 subcategories. If one is in the hostile class, it's very likely that they will end up in a political prison camp, some other type of detention facility. Access to any type of opportunity in North Korea depends on one's social classification. Information, messaging to North Koreans must rely on a thorough understanding of the application, the nature and application of the Songbun system of social discrimination in North Korea. The selection of information delivery vehicles will also be very important. The information environment of North Korea is not static. During the Great Famine of the 1990s, informal markets developed. Through these informal markets, information from the outside world comes in. South Korean, K-pop, K-drama, James Bond movies are very popular. Titanic is very popular. Any guesses as to why Titanic is popular? It sank on April the 15th, 1912, the day Kim Il-sung was born. So on the day the sun of the East was rising, this symbol of British imperialism was going under. So anyway, the idea is that more information is coming in, but it used to be VHS tapes and then CD-ROMs, DVDs, and then USBs. Now even USBs are a thing of the past. It's mostly or only micro SD cards, which are much smaller, easier to transport, easier to conceal. I will not get into details right now. In our report, we mentioned Starlink and the possibility of broadcasting a cell phone signal to North Korea. I am not a space engineer, I'm not a telecom engineer, none of us are. So there are obstacles to a system such as Starlink. About 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there was a system in South Korea actually that could broadcast direct satellite signal to mobile phones. However, those mobile phones needed an antenna. But a friend of mine, who's a reporter here in Washington, D.C., brought to my attention, I don't know if I can mention the name of companies, Nick, can I?
Sure.
All right, so there's a company, there are many of them out there that come up with solutions, technological solutions that will eventually bring down the information firewall of North Korea. For example, there's a company called AST Space Mobile. So basically, it's just a concept right now, but the idea is to establish a space-based broadband network, cellular broadband network. Basically, existing smartphones would be able to connect directly to satellites broadcasting this broadband signal. So how is this done? This would be suborbital satellites. HRNK has been using a lot of satellite imagery through the great service of Joseph Bermudez, and we know that we're in the midst of a suborbital satellite revolution. Now, this will have implications on satellite imagery, very, very important implications, but it will also have implications on the way a broadband signal is broadcast to Earth. So basically, people will be able to get fast broadband internet, spring allergies, without anything required. They'd be able to simply use their cell phones in order to receive the signal. So basically, geostationary satellites broadcasting TV signals, for example, satellite signals, are very high up. The signal weakens as it reaches the Earth, so you need antennas, parabolic antennas, and that kind of thing. But since this system would use, instead of geostationary satellites, LEO, low Earth orbit satellites, that would rise and set in rapid succession, you would have the possibility to broadcast directly to cell phones. Again, I don't understand the engineering of it. This is public information. It's out on YouTube. The way they would do this is to deploy large but thin satellites that would be compact, the size of a small car, and then flower up in orbit right before being deployed. So again, there is a vision, and I think that the DPRK regime has kept up with trying to block information from the outside world through judicial, extrajudicial means, coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment, through technological means. But it will be very hard, I think, for the DPRK regime to keep up with this kind of technology and this kind of change if one has the will to really invest in this type of initiative. Not a half-hearted approach to information, sending information to North Korea, but an approach really meant at real change. In the report, we mentioned spearheading international diplomacy. There is a coalition of the like-minded, the United States, the European Union, the Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others, who have promoted solid initiatives on North Korean human rights at the UN. The coalition is together again. That's great news. My colleagues who are here in the audience know were there with me, Raymond Ha and Laura Morrison. We were at the UN in Geneva just a couple of weeks ago. We hosted an event co-sponsored by Australia, the United States, the European Union, South Korea, Japan, and Romania. Good to see old and new members of the coalition. That was truly encouraging. The South Korean government has been very proactive. They have an ambassador at large on North Korean human rights, Ambassador Lee Shin-hwa, who's very good, very active, and very busy. And of course, South Korea is back after 5 years. They co-sponsor resolutions at the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council. So I am quite hopeful that the surge or the resurging of South Korean diplomacy at the UN and commitment to the coalition of the like-minded will bring about some good results. What has me really worried is that after the UN COI report, an African country such as Botswana decided to sever diplomatic relations with the DPRK because they were committing crimes against humanity. In 2017, another African country, Burkina Faso, decided to sever diplomatic relations with North Korea because of UN Security Council resolutions related to North Korean nuclear and missile developments. Very recently, Burkina Faso has decided to reestablish diplomatic relations with North Korea, and the foreign minister explicitly stated that it's about cooperation in the defense field, forget about the UN sanctions. So I'm a little bit worried that for a variety of reasons, for the past 5 years, an environment was created where it's no longer a problem, at least in the developing world, to get closer with the DPRK. to cooperate with the DPRK in some very unsavory areas. So I think we really have to keep an eye on that. Of course, we also make the point that exposing the connection between the nuclear program and the human rights abuses in North Korea is extraordinarily important. Fundamentally, the Kim regime's fundamental strategic objective is its own survival. Keeping the elites happy, the core elites happy. Nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles are seen as critical to maintaining the regime in power in order to procure the resources it needs for its nukes, missiles, and elites. The regime oppresses and exploits its own people at home and abroad. Of course, there are ways to connect human rights violations and the nuclear program more directly. Spoiler alert, we're working on one right now at HRNK. Finally, sidelining human rights to appease the Kim regime is not the answer, but as we put it in the report, it is a fundamental flaw. It has been a fundamental flaw in US policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Thank you to AEI for hosting us this morning. Let me put this in context. I was the special envoy for negotiations during the six-party talks. So let me sort of capture some of that dynamic from 2003 to 2006. The key issue for North Korea was, and still is, a normal relationship with the United States. We should keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. A normal relationship with the United States, but on their terms. On their terms being, as was mentioned a few minutes ago, as a nuclear weapons state. I can't tell you how many times it was mentioned to me, told to me, lectured to me that we did that with Pakistan. We could do it. You could do it with the North Korea, with the DPRK. Treat us the way you treated Pakistan, and we will be a good friend of yours. Because you do understand that we do not want to be tethered to the People's Republic of China. We want to open that up. And we would say, you got to understand something. To do that, it's not only the nuclear issue, and their focus was on the nuclear, because correctly cited was CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of all nuclear weapons. And we did get that in print, not in spirit, in print in 19 September 2005 with the joint statement. But what I would tell the North Koreans was very clear. If you truly want a normal relationship with the United States, it's more than giving up your nuclear weapons. It's more than that. It's your human rights situation. It's the values we have as a country, and as a country, we have a right to tell another country, if you want a normal relationship with us, this is how you have to behave. And we see your behavior on human rights as egregious. So that means you will have to start closing those political camps. You will have to have transparency. You will have to permit inspectors to go in. And what I got from my counterpart, Ambassador Egun, was very clear. It was very clear. He said, listen, DeTrani, you have to understand something. If this is what you're saying, if it's not just the nuclear, if you're putting human rights on the table here, we'll never normalize with the United States. Listen to that. We will never normalize with the United States. And what was just mentioned about a minute ago, a few minutes ago, Songbon, a class system, where you see these different, where you're born into a certain class, where you may be living your whole life in a political concentration camp. And you're saying, my God, there's something wrong with that equation. So remember this, and this is sort of part of what we talk a lot about in our report. Human rights is basic, but we've never formally put it front and center. Because as a negotiator, I will tell you this, those were never part of my talking points. They were never part of my talking points. My talking points were on the nuclear, ballistic missile issues. You need to work towards CVID. We need to get monitors in there. And even with the joint statement September 19, 2005, we saw in 2008, when North Korea refused to put nuclear monitors to leave the Yongbyon facility, the plutonium facility, and visit non-declared suspect facilities, they said, no, you can't leave. We said, wait a minute. We had an agreement here. We had an agreement in 2005. It says it. These monitors, it's a normal protocol with the IEA, with nuclear monitors. If you give them enough time, you tell them where you want to go, and you can go there. And that was the agreement. They said, no, you can't. You have to stay at Yongbyon. Well, it's pretty obvious why. The highly enriched uranium program, which continues to be the rub. Because North Korea, even with the agreed framework, even with the joint statement of 2005, even with the Leap Day Agreement, even with the if you will, the Singapore summit, was not committed, and I submit right now, is not committed to complete, verifiable dismantlement of all nuclear weapons. And that's the issue. But that's the issue. But what we've not made clear, and what we're doing now with this statement, we're a strategy, a very necessary, because it's a moral imperative as a nation, who we are. It's putting that front and center and saying, look, if you're not really willing to move on this issue, obviously we're not going to be moving towards progress, towards a normal relationship. Now, there's a lot of talk now about just accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, and maybe we can normalize and they could cease and desist, and eventually they'll give up their nuclear weapons. Well, that seems extremely unlikely based on everything we've just seen. North Korea now has more nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facility than ever before. The intercontinental ballistic missile that was launched on the 15th of March, 15,000 kilometers. The Hwasong 17, the Hwasong 15. What are we talking about, ladies and gentlemen? The hypersonic, the submarine launch, the short range, the cruise missiles going out. So we have to be real. This is an imperative. But let's scroll back to what I started this conversation with. A normal relationship with the United States. Because if you're living in that part of the world, and you're tethered to the People's Republic of China, and you're living with a lot of big countries around you, and we know the Korean Peninsula's history, strong people, dynamic people, courageous people, and creative, and so forth. But they're living in a tough neighborhood. Why not normalize? And indeed, going back to Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, indeed Kim Jong-un now as we speak, normalizing with the United States is the way to go. Why do you think the Singapore summit had traction, even with that very short, if you will, joint communique? It had traction because it was getting the attention from the country they want a relationship with, the United States. So if indeed they want a relationship with the United States, why don't we put front and center what we expect of them? And if we're looking at this egregious behavior on human rights, Greg, you just talked about that. And your committee does deep dives on that. And we hear from the refugees who come out, defectors, call it what you want. These are people who are seeking freedom, and they talk about the summarily executions where young men and women, children go and witness executions, and this is not who we are. So I want to focus on that as a key. We talk about China having leverage. And we say China has a lot of leverage because they have the economic relationship with North Korea. Over 90% of the fuel, the crude oil, comes from the People's Republic of China. So they need China. If China cut that off, North Korea would not survive. Certainly economically they would not survive. I submit they would not survive as a nation state. So they need China in that economic sense. And that's where they're tethered. That's where they're going. But they're looking to the United States because they know who we are and what it could mean for them, assuming that leadership stays in command. And that's the Kim family. And that was correctly cited here. the Kim family, survival of the Kim family, as long as that's not jeopardized in any way. Normalizing with the U.S. and then accepting them as a nuclear weapon state, and look, we've told them there's no way the United States is going to accept you as a nuclear weapon state. But again, human rights was never put there. If we have the human rights piece there, and we put it front and center, if they are looking, and I think eventually, I think we will see North Korea. I mean, my personal view, they'll come back to the table because they want a dialogue with the United States, because they realize it's the United States that's going to make a difference for them, even with a regime like North Korea. So what's necessary in this equation? If we have the leverage, and we do have the leverage because they want that relationship with us, let's talk about some of the things that are necessary. Information. And part of this strategy is getting information into North Korea. And as Ambassador Joseph said, this was during the Reagan administration. This is what we did with the Soviet Union. I worked for Bill Casey at that time. I can tell you we were very active in doing some of these things. Getting in, not misinformation, not disinformation, but truthful information. Letting the people know what the situation is in their own country because they deny that information. Letting the people know how it is living in the Republic of Korea. And it's not the destitute agrarian society that the North Korean people were told about. It's a dynamic society there, one where there are values, and the people are thriving in that regard. Getting truthful information about what's happening in the world. And will this then be a pressure, as it was for the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev, glasnost, perestroika, glasnost, indeed, openness, getting people and possibly the leadership, Kim Jong-un. I was hopeful in 2011, and obviously that was misplaced to a great extent. In 2000, thinking he would bring that breath of fresh air. He would change that equation. But we've gone back, and we saw that very quickly with the execution of his uncle, his half brother, and other things that are going on there in regards to human rights. But getting information into North Korea to indeed the people, the 25 million people, but the elites. The elites, many of them who travel around the world, certainly in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, who know what's going on in the world. Getting information there, but also to Kim Jong-un and those few people around him, the circle around him. He was in Singapore, and we have to remember in Singapore, when he met with former President Donald Trump, he highlighted that to his own people. I mean, he went back to North Korea, and he showed some videos of his travels in Singapore. Very unusual, because that's not an agrarian society. He's showing how these people live. So he was sort of front and center, and he was probably feeling very good about himself, getting the attention from the President of the United States, and did that. So will that have impact? Will that have impact on the people, where the people say, this is a Confucian society, ladies and gentlemen. It goes both ways. We will be loyal to the emperor, we'll be loyal to the leader, but it has to come down where that leader has to care for its people. And when you see, we're talking about the potential for starvation in North Korea as we speak. As we speak. In the 1990s, we saw over 1 million. That's a conservative estimate. Million people dying of starvation. What we're talking about is the prospects of starvation again in North Korea, with over 40% of the population malnourished. This is a UN study done with the DPRK. So this is all information out there. So why not get information in there? Why not push the values? Why not put the human rights situation front and center? Because these are the values of the United States, who we are as a people, and what we feel strongly about. Getting information and moving it. And we did that with the Reagan administration. I submit, I think it was a very successful there. I'll end on this point. We're not paying enough attention to North Korea. I can't understand that. We're not paying enough attention. This is a country that's showing us. There's nothing clandestine about this. It's not like their highly enriched uranium program that's clandestine, and they don't want to reveal the sites, so they continue to produce nuclear weapons. despite the fact that they tell us they've denuclearized or moving towards denuclearization. This is front and center with what they're doing with the ICBMs, with the Hwasong 17s, what they're doing across the board. And they're telling us very, very clearly. And now they always told us clearly with their new policy of preemptive strike, first use. If we feel threatened, if there's a perception of an imminent threat, we'll use our nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. And they even exercise. They showed us their exercise. And they made it very clear they have the sites in South Korea. Let's get on with this. Let's move this strategy. And Ambassador Joseph and my colleagues here, and thank you, Nick, for hosting us here this morning so we could talk about these things, are telling this administration, but also telling a future administration. When we look at 2024, we've got to focus on this issue here, and we've got to make this a centerpiece. And if it is a centerpiece, I submit this, my last point, I submit this. If Kim Jong-un is very serious about our relationship with the United States, and we continue with our nuclear thing, but that's down the road, and that could be 10, 15 years down the road, but we put human rights up front, we've never demanded progress on that. Hopefully we would. Hope is not a strategy, right? But we've got to put it out there. And if there's no movement on that, it's pretty obvious where we're going on that, where we are. So thank you for hosting us this morning, Nick. And I would submit on this strategy here, the more we could talk about North Korea writ large and what they're doing, not only on their nuclear and their missiles, but what they're doing on human rights, it's so egregious. It's a moral imperative, as you said, Ambassador, a moral imperative. And we've not, I'm telling you from where I sat, we've not made this a centerpiece, or we've not even made it a talking point. How wrong. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much. Thank you all. Before I bring our audience into the discussion, I'd like to ask each of you a quick question, and I'll list them all here. Bob, there's a different viewpoint about the reason for continuing failure, different from the one that's in the analysis here that we've shared together. And that argument, we've seen it in some of the newspapers that have been published. We've heard this voiced in various circles. The argument is that the problem is we haven't recognized DPRK as a nuclear weapon state. Once we recognize DPRK as a nuclear weapon state, they will negotiate like a normal power with us about issues of mutual concern. What is the problem with that argument? Greg, I'd like to ask you, there are some people in human rights circles who are absolutely adamant that human rights and international security issues should never meet, almost like church and state, that bringing together international security and human rights issues will instrumentalize human rights. Clearly, the writers of this report do not agree with that. Can you explain the reasons for this? And Joe, in the report, a number of different myths are explicitly addressed and I think quite effectively dispelled. There is an additional question which is not addressed directly in the report that I would like to ask you about. This is the argument that no progress on the North Korean problem can be made without China's assent, without China's cooperation and agreement. Is that a myth? So let me ask you in our lightning round just to go through this each briefly.
Okay, let me answer your question to the best that I can, but I also want to respond to a couple of things that have been said, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
First, in terms of recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. Under the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there are only 5 nuclear weapon states. The United States, At the time, the Soviet Union, now Russia, China, France, and Great Britain. If we were to recognize North Korea, I think that would have a profound negative effect on the NPT regime, okay? We have never recognized Pakistan as a nuclear weapon state, formally. And remember, Pakistan never signed the NPT. Same with India, the same with Israel. North Korea signed, violated, and then left the NPT, along with every other agreement it has ever made in the nuclear area, whether it's the North-South Agreement, whether it's the Agreed Framework, whether it's the September 2005 agreement. There are multiple agreements. Every one they violated, starting with the safeguards agreements with the IAEA. So why would be, even if we did recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, why would we think that we could have an agreement that they would abide by? Why would you ever think that? I mean, the only explanation is, as Samuel Johnson once said about second marriages, the triumph of hope over experience. I mean, this is, we know how this is going to end. And that leads me to, Joe, your comment on we're not doing enough. And why aren't we doing enough? I don't think we're not doing enough. We're kind of putting it on the back burner, kind of ignoring it, while North Korea builds more and more nuclear weapons. Just look at what they've stated recently. Kim comes out and says, we need to basically accelerate our nuclear weapons program, do everything possible to increase the number of nuclear weapons we have. And Joe, you cited the Hwasan 17. You've got 11 of them rolling down the parade route, right? Along with what was also considered to be a likely solid fuel ICBM, which has enormous sort of consequences for missile defense and for deterrence. Well, the reason I don't think we're doing enough, we don't know what else to do as a government. And the last place I would look for innovation, the last place I would look for change is in our own government, in our own institutions. They're simply unable to deal with this. So we put it to the back burner. And we have our envoy going around the world saying, we're willing to sit down with North Korea anywhere, anytime, any place, no conditions. And he does that again. And then another month later, he does it again. And North Korea continues to build up its nuclear arsenal. I think, the inability to change sort of leads you, after 30 years, leads you to the conclusion that what we need is new leadership. The Biden administration isn't going to change its policy. They're not going to do that, okay? If there is, another Trump administration, they're not going to change what they did. They're not going to do that, okay? What you need is somebody who comes into office, a man or a woman who comes into office dedicated to change, dedicated and knowingly appoints the right people in the right places in government to ensure that we can get the job done. And that's the only way I think we're going to succeed in terms of promoting our own strategy. The odds are against us, okay? I mean, there's no doubt about it. And we could be having this conversation 5 years from now, and it will be a much more difficult, a much greater challenge from North Korea. Let me go to the point on normal relations. Do we really want a normal relationship with North Korea? You mentioned Reagan. Reagan didn't want a normal relationship with the Soviet Union. He saw the Soviet Union as evil, both domestically and in terms of the oppression of the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. That was his vision. He didn't want a normal relationship. He didn't want détente. He didn't want war, okay? But he didn't want détente or somehow manage the relationship. When he was asked about his strategy for the Cold War, he said, and I quote, "We win, they lose." Okay? That was sort of his sort of leadership position. And a few years later, we won. In large part due to the buildup of his offensive capabilities, SDI, the deployment of INF missiles in Europe, real hard sort of core measures that had a profound impact on the Soviet leadership. And human rights was part of that. It was a very important part of that. So again, what we're looking for is leadership. And third, and this really affects both of my previous comments, the North Korean leadership, the Kim dynasty, is not able to change for the better. It can get worse, and it will get worse. I guarantee you it'll get worse unless we change our policy and have some degree of success. But it's not going to change for the better. Because if it becomes more moderate, if it becomes better in terms of the treatment of its own people, if it becomes less belligerent, if it does away with its nuclear capabilities, the regime goes away. Because it's the enemy, because the greatest enemy is the North Korean people. And the regime understands that. They cannot change, and they will not change.
Thank you, Bob.
Not so much of a lightning round, but
It was lightning.
It was going a long way. It's just traveling at the speed of light. Greg?
Nick, I'm restating the obvious here, stating the obvious. The security establishment, from an IR theory perspective, the security establishment relies more on a realist view of international affairs, with power being up front and center. Us human rights characters, of course, rely on a liberal view of international relations. We believe that through information, through empowering the people of North Korea, for example, change might come from within. I think an approach that combines these two IR theories and other IR theories as well to the DPRK would be a very constructive way to approach this issue. Of course, there is a cultural bias. There are human rights defenders who would not want to be anywhere near security experts. And of course, there are security experts, we've said this today, who believe that human rights is just a nuisance, an obstacle in the way of addressing very important issues. Is human rights weaponized sometimes? Yes. And I would say that, well, a most recent example of weaponizing North Korean human rights, summit diplomacy. So at the initial stages, former President Trump was doing really well on North Korean human rights. Remember this spectacular speech in Seoul, November 2017, music to our ears. Then a disabled North Korean activist, Chi Song-ho, appeared at the State of the Union address. Remember that triumphant moment? He lifted up his crutches, he walked on crutches to escape North Korea through China. A group of other 7, together with Chi Song-ho, met the president in the Oval Office, and then human rights completely disappeared off the radar screen. It was obviously just an instrument used to, pressure Kim Jong-un to engage in this summit diplomacy. Is it all doom and gloom? I think that the human rights defender has to be a pragmatist. If opportunity presents itself, even if there is a risk that human rights will be just an instrument and will be weaponized, you have to take that opportunity. Did anything good come out of that State of the Union address? Yes, absolutely. Chi Song-ho, the disabled activist, is now a member of the South Korean National Assembly, and he's doing really well, I have to tell you. I just saw him a few days ago here in Washington. He's doing really well. He hasn't become just another South Korean politician. He's a fellow who really works hard to help out his fellow North Koreans. So the point is that, yes, this happens. Human rights may be weaponized, and on the other hand, we don't have the greatest resources within the human rights community or the greatest leverage. So I think that we have to consider very carefully every opportunity that's presented to us.
Thank you, Greg. Joe?
Thank you for the question, Nick. No, I think it's the United States that has the leverage. It's not China. It's the United States. And I think my comments spoke to that issue. North Korea wants that relationship with the United States. They have that relationship with China. They've lived with China for decades, centuries, millennia. So it's the United States that we have the leverage. What China has is the economic relationship the relationship, because North Korea is tethered to China. They're isolated. As a pariah state, they're isolated. And this is where Kim Jong-un is saying, and his father, and even his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, we need to open that up, open that spigot up, open it up. Not just be reliant on the People's Republic of China. So, and it's the United States. And so we have that leverage, and if we have that leverage, are we using it? Are we using it? And I think the consensus here around this table, and this report speaks to it, one of the most glaring issues is human rights. It's never been put forth as a core element of our negotiations.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to bring our audience, both in our headquarters and online, into our discussion now. To start off, I'd like to ask Colonel David Maxwell, who's one of the co-authors of this study, if he has any comments in addition to those that the authors on stage have already contributed.
Thank you, Nick. And is this on? Okay. Yep. Thank you, Nick. And it's always educational to hear these gentlemen. I think everybody got a little taste of what our working group was like, because the depth of discussion was just tremendous. And every time I hear these gentlemen speak, I learn things. Just one point I'd like to make that was just slightly, I think, touched on. The third element of this strategy is really the pursuit of a free and unified Korea. And this is the 70th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement. And in paragraph 60 of the Armistice Agreement, those military leaders recognized that the only way we're going to see an end to the Korea question, what they call the Korea question, which is the unnatural division of the peninsula, is through a political solution. And the political solution really is, as Ambassador Joseph outlined, is change from within. And what we are proposing with human rights, with information, is really helping to give the Korean people in the North, the second-tier leadership, those that are able, really options, and the option is to change from within and understand what their situation is, what the situation is in South Korea, throughout the world, and the opportunities that will come forth when there is a free and unified Korea that can and should and motivate them to make change. And so we're not talking about regime change. We're talking about the Korean people in the North taking the opportunity to change their way. And then we need to be prepared, and I say that's the royal we. South Korea needs to be prepared with the support of their allies, the United States and the international community, to make that happen so that there will be someday a united Republic of Korea, because as we mentioned, as long as the Kim family regime is in power, there will be no end to the nuclear program, nor an end to the human rights abuses and the crimes against humanity. So that acceptable, durable political arrangement that's going to serve and protect and advance our interests is really a free and unified Korea. And that's what we should be pursuing. Human rights and information are really the two major components that can contribute to achieving that.
Very good. Thank you very much. Ladies and gents, any questions or comments for our panelists on this study? One, any other, what I'd like to do, if possible, is I'd like to collect a couple of questions or comments at the same time, then let our panelists respond. I see we've got a bit of one. Do we have others? Why don't we start with yours, of course?
I'm Susan Komori. I work with the Japanese families whose relatives were abducted by North Korea. We've seen a regime in South Korea change to raise the issue of abductions on the South Korean victims, as well as support the Japanese side again in just the last couple of months. And we've also seen the South Korean government take the step of responding to the threat of strategic nuclear weapons by suggesting that they should have their own nuclear program. So I'm wondering, looking at these changes, how the State Department is going to respond, and perhaps adjust its own thinking with these kind of changes in the region. Japan has always supported the human rights approach because of the abductions, although it has also supported in the secondary position, addressing the nuclear and missile issues at the same time. But I'd like to hear your comments on all of those.
Thank you very much. Gents, any responses to Susan's question?
Well, could you just capture your question again, Susan? What is the question again?
So how is the State Department going to adjust to the changes in its allies and the priority that its allies are now placing on human rights, not just Japan, but also South Korea again?
So, let me just say, and hopefully this report is generating, I believe, as we speak, a lot of interest, even in this administration, the human rights situation. You mentioned the abductee issue, always front and center with the government of Japan, and that's so correct on that. Each of the countries, when we had an agreement in 2005 with the six-party talks, each country then had a dialogue with the North Koreans as to how you normalize a relationship. For the Japanese, it was you got to resolve the abductee issue, and nuclear will help us there. For the United States, it was also a question of not only CVID, but also the human rights issue here. It's got to be accentuated. You talked about South Korea talking about nuclear weapons. Countries are South Korea, whether Japan. We see Japan now on the defense side putting a lot more money into their defense industry so that they could be more viable in the national defense issues, on national defense issues. There's no question about that. It's a question of us being more of a player in the region, and we're enhancing deterrence, and we see the joint military exercises as what they are now. So. Yeah, there's a lot going on there, and that's, I'll look to my colleagues here, but we've got to listen to our allies, because without our allies, we're just not a viable player in the region.
Greg and Bob?
Bob, would you like to go first? Please. Susan, I run a non-governmental organization and cannot speak on behalf of the State Department. But as an outsider, what I observe is that, of course, the nature of Japanese and South Korean politics is a bit different. They're both democracies, no doubt about that. In Japan, there is mostly one party, the LDP, that's in power. In Korea, you see these changes that have an impact on South Korea's approach to human rights, including POWs, including abductees, including the degree of cooperation with Japan on human rights and the abductee issue in particular. So during progressive administrations that are prone to appeasing the North Korean regime by ignoring the human rights issue, we know what happens. For 5 years in a row, they do not co-sponsor UN resolutions. Under conservative governments in South Korea, especially under this one, of President Yoon, South Korea regains interest and becomes very proactive. Again, an outsider's observation, I think that the US State Department welcomes tripartite cooperation that makes sense from a security perspective, from a military perspective, and from a human rights perspective as well. I think that South Korea and Japan working together on abductees and other human rights issues together with us, the United States, makes the life of State Department officials easier than before.
Bob?
Yeah, there's a commonly used talking point at the State Department, and it says, I'm with you 100%, but now is not the time. And that's how I really see sort of, the State Department response to human rights. I mean, there are a lot of really good professionals, great Americans at the State Department. They believe what they're saying. And some of them actually believe in human rights as an important element of US policy. They'll all say that, some of them actually believe that. But I don't see human rights becoming part of sort of the mainstream, hardcore, they would consider it, strategic policy vis-a-vis North Korea. The focus is going to continue to be on the nuclear. I will say something positive about this administration when it comes to the issue of the desire on the part of many in South Korea and an increasing number in Japan to have their own nuclear deterrent. I certainly understand the reason for that, and we've dealt with that going back to de Gaulle. And is the U.S. going to trade New York for Paris? It's a long-standing sort of challenge that we have. And I'm not for South Korea and Japan going nuclear, if you will. And what this administration has done, and I think rather well, is they have increased consultation on nuclear issues. They have increased cooperation and exercises in a way that I think strengthens, in the view of Seoul and Tokyo, the credibility of the U.S. nuclear guarantee. This is not the first time. Okay, when North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in October of 2006, that was a shock. It was a shock to the NPT regime. There was concern all across the globe. There was a particular shock, as you might think, in Asia, in North Asia. And it was incumbent on the U.S., and Secretary Rice did a terrific job at the time, of going to Tokyo, going to Seoul, reaffirming our nuclear guarantee. And we're in that sort of same process now, but that's not enough. And over time, unless we change our policy, unless we're perceived by our allies as doing something that is not only credible but effective, I think we're going to lose that one as well. And that's going to be a real challenge to the nuclear non-proliferation regime and could very well light the fuse for much further proliferation in the region and outside of the region.
We have, I think, one more question from Dr. Marcus Nolan of the Peterson Institute, also a board member at HRNK. Mark, before you offer us your comment or question, I'd also like to ask our panel to think about any final comments or points that you'd like to make. So let's listen to this question and then go to summation.
First of all, congratulations on a really interesting panel. I look forward to reading this report. I came in late, and so if you've already covered this, I apologize. I find myself in a somewhat odd position. I'm an economist. I've done work on the North Korean economy. I've done refugee surveys. I've surveyed firms operating in North Korea. I normally operate in the realm of what somebody once called low politics, what's kind of happening on the ground. So a foray into high politics is not this is not my strong suit. But I've been really surprised that in this discussion, at least since I've been here, the word Russia has never come up. And I would have thought that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good thing for North Korea. They've been showing their loyalty to the Russians in the UN. The US government says they're sending weapons to the Russians. Given past history, I would not be surprised if they're sending personnel, if not actually in Ukraine, then supporting the Russian war effort from within Russia. It seems to me that gives them kind of a stronger hand via the US and an alternative to a certain extent to China. So I would just be interested in the reactions of the panelists, whether this development, at least for some period, will actually strengthen the North Korean disinterest in engaging with us in any serious way about the nuclear issues or the human rights issues that have been the core of the discussion this morning. Thank you.
So in addition to any final summations which you may have, the question of the from Russia with love option for DPRK. Gentlemen, maybe we go through the same way that we've done with Bob, Greg, Joe.
Well, Marcus, I think you framed it rather well. I think that North Korea sees an opportunity in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine. and it's to expand their relationship in many different ways. I mean, military sales, et cetera, but also politically. But at the end of the day, Russia itself is becoming more and more of a vassal state to China. And the North Korean leadership understands that. And so it's really, I think, a mixed record. In terms of my final comment, I'm often criticized as having undermined the arms control process with North Korea, including recently. It's usually Bolton and Joseph. We sabotaged the agreed framework. We certainly advocated getting out of the agreed framework after North Korea was found in material breach of the agreement by pursuing enriched uranium. But nevertheless, we sabotaged this, we sabotaged that, all the way through from 2001 to 2007 when I left government. But here I am, sort of, characterized, criticized as hard right. But a long time ago, I concluded, and it's with regard to North Korea and Iran, that until these regimes go away, and they need to go away by the people, by the people of Iran and North Korea, creating the circumstances for the fall of the regime. And we've addressed that in terms of influence and information campaigns. That's the only way we're going to resolve these issues. It's not like I'm against arms control, okay? I'm against bad arms control, but look at Libya, okay? I had the opportunity of leading the secret negotiations on Libya. That turned out just fine. And this was a regime that was, not exactly positive on human rights. I mean, this was a brutal regime as well. Nothing like North Korea, and I would argue nothing like Iran. But they came in third, and we did negotiate with them, and we did get an agreement, and we did send a large ship over, and we did load up hundreds of metric tons of everything associated with their nuclear equipment, their nuclear program, as well as their long-range missiles, and we brought them back to the United States. Now, that's not going to happen with North Korea, and it's not going to happen with Iran. The only way we're going to achieve, achieve denuclearization in both of those instances is through the people reclaiming their basic dignity and creating a free and in the case of Korea, a unified Korea.
Thank you.
Mark, during the Cold War, Kim Il-sung, as you know very well, played this game of playing mommy against daddy, China against Russia. Back then, Russia had the resources to engage in that game. Probably, especially under the current circumstances with the ongoing war in Ukraine, there are fewer resources to dedicate to propping up North Korea. Also, to a traditional relationship with China that has sometimes been a troubled relationship, not always the lips and teeth. North Korea continues and will continue to be dependent on China. That said, the Russians, as you know very well, prior to the COVID-induced withdrawal of foreign diplomats, had a very significant presence at their embassy in North Korea, about 200 people, I believe, including probably dependents, family members. But nevertheless, North Korea continued to be very important to Russia, but Russia has not necessarily had the resources to have the same level of influence that it once had, as Soviet Union, of course. That said, the current conflict in Ukraine has, I'm stating the obvious again, has deepened the rift between status quo powers on the UN Security Council, us, the UK, the French, and revisionist powers, the Russians and the Chinese, together with allies, we know who they are. And this has created space for the North Korean regime to misbehave even more. I think that there is less fear of repercussions given this ever-deepening rift. And of course, they're on the side of these revisionist powers that are challenging the international system as we know it.
Joe?
Yeah, no, Marcus, good question. I think what the North Koreans, one of the takeaways from the war in Ukraine is on the issue of security the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances from Russia, but also from the United Kingdom and the United States. And it brings back memories to me, because I would always be told by my counterparts in negotiations, the North Koreans would always say, but you have to understand, Mr. DeTrani, a security assurance is a piece of paper that you could tear up. If you want us to dismantle all our nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars and lots of work. It's not a piece of paper you could tear up. So I think it's solidified that element in North Korea that supports Kim Jong-un, that's saying, we will never give up our nuclear weapons. We will never give up our nuclear weapons. So I think that's point one. I don't think, look, China has viewed North Korea, and North Korea understands this better certainly than we, as a vassal state. Bob, you mentioned a vassal state. As a vassal state. I don't think they wanted to be in that position. They want to be in that position. So my final point would be this. We do have the leverage, because they don't want to be in that category. They don't want to be viewed as that vassal state. And that relationship with the United States is so important. Therefore, why not put these issues front and center? Why not try to incite change from within, as we're saying in this report, with information that goes in there, and so forth. And I think that's critical. And the last point then on my last comment is, this is not getting any better. What are we doing here? They're just going to be better. We're just watching it. It's like watching a show, and you sort of get a sense of what the ending is, and you're saying, well, did we want that ending? Do something. And I think this is an imperative. We've got to all do something.
Joe, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our program. Thank you very much for joining. Gentlemen, thank you very much for contributing this national strategy for countering North Korea. I commend it to you all if you have not read it. A really interesting diagnosis of the failure of counterproliferation with North Korea to date, of promising approaches for the future, and the urgency of including human rights in North Korea in a successful approach. Thank you all very much, and congratulations.